All right, so this is chapter 7, emotions and communication. So when we think about understanding our emotions, it's important for us to define emotions. So emotions are our experience and interpretation of internal sensations as they are shaped by physiology, perceptions, language, and social experiences. Emotions that include our physiological influences, our perceptual influences, our cultural influences. Also, in tune with our culture are our emotional communities that we are a part of and what that means in the framing of our emotions and how we view emotions. Our framing rules, they help us to define meaning and make sense of what it is that we're supposed to feel. Our feeling rules are what tell us what we have a right to feel. And then our emotion work is generating what we think are appropriate feelings for each communicative event. Emotional intelligence then is defined as the ability to recognize feelings, to judge which feelings are appropriate in which situations, and to communicate those feelings effectively. I think a great example here is Sheldon from Big Bang Theory, who is assumed and is said to actually suffer from Asperger's, which keeps him from being able to have as much social awareness as one would think that he needs to. So oftentimes conversations go over his head, or he looks at something from a very surface level, or he thinks too critically about something that is meant to be a joke. Thus, his emotional intelligence, is measured differently. And there is a clip in our Blackboard folder for this chapter that focuses on and asks you to think about Sheldon's response to a communication event. So go check that out after you finish watching this. Obstacles to communicating effectively. So these are reasons we may not express emotions. So cultural and social expectations. So for example, race, class, and gender. All of those are foundational, socially constructive ways in which we categorize and we group people. And because of this, we may not express emotions because of what people perceive about certain groups or certain folks socialize into these different containers or criterias, but also because of what we perceive about ourselves and what we think we are supposed to perform. Self-protection. An example of this is the chilling effect. So when we think about maybe if we give someone the silent treatment, if we're upset, or if we walk around and we're asked if something is wrong and we're one-wording people and when there really is something wrong, but we don't want to be emotionally attached or emotionally available. Protecting others, saving face and face theory. In chapter 2, you go over and we review this information from Goffman about front stage and backstage. And so sometimes we don't express emotion because we may not want to embarrass or hurt another person. So if you've ever seen someone fall and you've laughed, you know that if someone you care about falls and they actually hurt themselves, or someone falls that you care about and they don't hurt themselves, and you may want to spare them the added emotional imbalance, you may not laugh in that circumstance. So that would be an example of protecting others and maybe not expressing emotions in a genuine or visceral way that you would. Our social and professional roles. So our objective roles are occupation. So obviously you may not express emotions at work the same way that you would at home, because some of the ways that you may express your emotion at home may be inappropriate for the workplace or vice versa. The ineffective expression of emotions is really important. So when we think about these obstacles, again, speaking generalities, so not being specific. So, if someone asks you a question and you respond, then you want to be sure that you're using language that makes sense. You want to ensure that the language that you're speaking, the words that you're using, aren't just general words, but they're specific. Sometimes someone will ask you, "How are you doing?" And you'll say, "I'm fine." Well, what does fine mean, right? Fine can mean different things depending on the context of the conversation, but also how are you actually feeling? So counterfeit emotional language, unclear linguistic descriptions. So again, if we were to use the same example of someone saying fine, that they're fine or they're doing good, but they're really having a terrible day, those emotions are counterfeit. They're saying that based on the context of the situation, based on who they're speaking to, who they may be speaking with. Maybe they're uncomfortable, maybe they're in a social surrounding that makes them feel uncomfortable. And so it's really important to make sure that we're able to guard against these obstacles for effective communication. Not owning one's feelings. An example of this is in accountability resistant you statements versus I statements. And so this is really important when we're thinking about situations where we may have a disagreement with a person, and we also may not be able to fully articulate what it is that we feel. One thing that happens in relationships and arguments a lot is that we tend to blame other people when in fact something may be a person's fault, right? It may not be your own. But oftentimes if we can really try to dig deep and use I statements and say, like, instead of you made me mad, or when you did this, I responded in that way, you can respond possibly by saying, actually, I felt offended when you mentioned this because it reminded me of my childhood or made me feel bad. So you want to use I statements as much as possible because that takes that blame off of that other person, and more than likely the person will come around and say, like, oh, because you're using those I statements, I recognize that and I'm sorry if I made you feel a certain way, if I hurt your feelings, or if I offended you. So we think about social media and emotions. Social media is an amazing place. And so I, always laugh when people change their statuses on social media. And we've talked about this a bit in class about how people want to showcase a face to an audience that they cannot necessarily see back. So while people may be viewing your post, how many people are going to interact with you dependent on your changing moods or the moods that you feel? Unless maybe you communicate something that stands out to another person. So think about the unfortunate atrocities that have occurred when people have committed suicide and they put a social media post up about it, right? Or people have done damage to themselves or have hurt other people, but there were warnings online. So how do we mitigate that, and how do we make sense of that in the sociocultural world and apply some of the skill sets that we've learned? One of my favorite memes is, concerned around Kermit the Frog drinking his Lipton's iced tea, and so this idea of drinking tea and knowing that you have an understanding of something that you try to communicate to someone else and that they didn't pay attention to that, and now they may be in a situation that you try to provide them an exit to early on, oftentimes allows you to be a little bit passive aggressive. And so we want to steer clear of that, even though the memes are actually pretty funny and they do direct us to think about these social situations where we're communicating effectively or ineffectively. And then finally, our guidelines for communicating emotions effectively are: you want to identify your emotions, be clear, be truthful, be honest about how you feel. Choose whether and how to express those emotions. Sometimes it's not necessary to express what you feel to other people. Sometimes you need time to think. And when you do express, you need to be mindful of how people will perceive you, but also, are you communicating in the most effective way? Are you utilizing the necessary emotional intelligence so that the information that comes from you is concise and it makes sense? Own your feelings. Again, own what you feel. Definitely hold other people accountable for how they make you feel, but definitely own your feelings. Don't feel bad about what you feel. Like, own your feelings and feel those. Monitor your self-talk. Intrapersonally, we have to consider the ways that we talk to ourselves. Oftentimes that reflects in the additional ways that we talk to other people and even the ways in which we act. So you want to make sure that you don't beat yourself up too much if you get a bad grade on a test, or, if you do something wrong, that you make amends to fix that and you watch how you talk to yourself. You want to also adapt a rational, emotive approach to feelings. Again, this is centered in the idea of having emotional intelligence. So coming from a place of wisdom, but also coming from a place of, these are my feelings and this is how I feel and I need to have this addressed. And also being able to recognize when you may actually be participating in a hypersensitive space and what that looks like if you take a step back, or if you do some breathing exercises. And then finally, respond sensitively when others communicate emotions. And sometimes this is really hard because we all have things going on. We all respond to different phenomena differently, but we want to be mindful of other people's experiences, other people's lived experiences. Just because something happens and it doesn't make you mad or doesn't make you upset doesn't mean that another person won't feel that way. And so you want to make sure that you're listening, that you're being an active listener, but also that you're being mindful of the verbal and the nonverbal communication that you're sharing with that person. Sometimes you may have a friend who does not know how to be quiet, who is just really gushing with feelings and emotions, and you may not have time. And so one of the best things you can do is say, I really appreciate you sharing this information with me. I'm here to talk. However, I have to go. I'm not able to sit with you for this whole time to discuss this, but I am here for you, even if you need to call me on the phone or if you need to schedule time to talk. So you just want to make sure that you're being conscious and that you're being mindful. And again, considering the golden rule, how would I want somebody to treat me if I was going through something? So this completes our video for our chapter on emotions. Thanks for viewing.